to our fifth Network Cafe of our series, and to 2024, which is super exciting, a new year for our cafe series and for our network. Excited to see what it brings for everybody. My name's Colleen Stewart. For those who don't know me, I'm the communications coordinator for the New Hampshire Food Alliance. As I said, you're all welcome to continue introducing yourselves in the chat, sharing whatever you'd like about yourself to the rest of the folks on the call. Again, you'll see our agenda in there, and myself and my colleague Nicole will continue to share that so folks can follow along with our presentation for the day. Before we get started, I just want to set a little grounding for everybody, especially for those who are new and this may be their first Network Cafe. They may not know a lot about the work of the Food Alliance or what we do. So I just want to share a little bit about our work and our connections to UNH and all that good stuff. So the New Hampshire Food Alliance, we are a statewide network, and we engage and connect people who are dedicated to growing a thriving, fair, and sustainable local food system here in the Granite State. One part of our work is this Network Cafe series, which runs on the first Friday of each month from September to April. And we use it as a space for conversation and learning about various food system topics. And it's a place for everyone who's here to virtually connect with others, not only on this topic, but on their work and connections that they see through our conversations during this time. And we do all this work and more as a community outreach program of the Sustainability Institute at UNH in Durham. As part of UNH, we share the university's dedication to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. We believe those four tenets are foundational to achieving our core educational mission and embracing the many characteristics of our community members that make them uniquely themselves. And as part of all that work and commitment to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, we believe it's important to continually acknowledge the hardships the Indigenous communities in our region have faced, as well as the positive impact they have in our community through we do so through the UNH Land, Water, and Life Acknowledgement, which I will read a little bit from right now. As we all journey on the trail of life, we wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to Indakina, homeland, which the University of New Hampshire community is honored to steward today. We also acknowledge the hardships they continue to endure after the loss of unceded homelands and champion the university's responsibility to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of the Indigenous people who carry forward the traditions of their ancestors. So that's just a little snippet of our work and our dedication to that diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as echoing UNH's as well. Last thing before I send us into our presentation for the day, I just want to point everybody to that agenda document that I shared, particularly two pieces of that document, which are our desired outcomes for the day, which again will give you a good framing and understanding of what we're going to talk about, as well as our working agreement. They're both linked, or they're both on that document. The working agreement is linked there, and that working agreement is just our expectations of everyone here and what you can expect from us while we spend some time together today. So I'm going to pass it to Nicole. She's going to introduce our speaker for the day and provide us a little framing.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you everyone for being here. Happy 2024 to you all. Some of you have been here for others in this series, but in this academic year, the 2023 to 2024 Network Cafe series, we've focused on the New England Feeding New England report, a regional approach to food system resilience. And for those of you familiar with it, you know that this is a wealth of data pulled together by the New England Food System Planners Partnership, of which the New Hampshire Food Alliance represents New Hampshire, and there are the 5 other New England states food systems networks shown on the screen here, represented in collaboration with Food Solutions New England. So this New England Food System Planners Partnership commissioned the research and writing of the New England Feeding New England report over the last few years. And that report was published early this past summer. And as we all sat with the information within it, we thought this is so much valuable data, but it's overwhelming to know how to dig into it. And we thought the best thing that we could do for our network was to bring you the research leads from each of the volumes and ask them to share a little bit about what they learned and answer questions for you. So that's what we're doing here today. Today we're on volume 4, and we have Holly Fowler from Northbound Ventures here with us. Before we're on the last of the ones on these lists. So Holly led the team that looked at understanding market channels. And the premise of the regional approach to food system resilience report is at its core is the question, what would it look like to source 30% of our food as a region from within New England? And so to dig into that, the researchers looked at what are we currently growing or producing, catching, raising in New England? What are we currently eating in New England? And then where do those two circles intersect rather? And so for Holly's part of that question, she looked at, her team looked at how market channels have the current ability to get local food into local markets in New England and maybe the future capacity to expand that as well. So before I hand it to her, I'm going to read her bio because Holly is such a delight and interacts with many of us in our work. So if you know her, you know she's a force. And I thought it'd be a treat to read her bio. Holly Fowler is a recognized sustainability leader, systems thinker, and strategic advisor with 15 years of international business experience. She has consulted on sustainable agriculture, energy, water, waste, health, and employee engagement to clients of all sizes in all sectors, including Fortune 500 companies, national healthcare networks, public school districts, city and state governments, and nonprofits. She has a professional certificate in sustainable food systems leadership from the University of Vermont, a master's of business administration from Babson College, and a bachelor of administration from Bowdoin College. So we're so delighted to have you here with us, Holly. And we've asked her to speak about who was her research team, what were they trying to answer, and what are some of the bits that she took away from her volume, the volume here. Holly,
Well,
you there?
I am. I was going to say, thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Colleen. Hello to everyone. Happy New Year. Just waiting for the embarrassment to exit in order to begin the presentation. But thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to share some of this work that our team dedicated a lot of months and effort to. Let's see. Get back here to my. So this was not a singular effort by any stretch of the imagination. So I was joined by Laura Barley, who at the time was with American Farmland Trust, and now has a great position at MDAR. But Laura really helped with some of the direct-to-consumer pieces of this. Ramon Borges Mendez is a professor at Clark University, and he really was a dog with a bone when it came to the whole scratching the grocery retail sector for us. And so a lot of the important information we gathered was the result of his primary and secondary research. Michelle Klager is with Helianth Partners, and Michelle really has a deep understanding of the distribution world and helped us to unpack that. And then Hannah Layton and Scott Richardson, Hannah from Farm to Institution New England that many of you know, and my business partner, Scott Richardson, contributed largely to understanding the institutional sectors that we'll get into here. So the research questions that we started with, Nicole alluded to these a bit, but basically we were asked to illustrate how do people get food. So you know, you've covered now this territory of how it's grown and what people eat and the dietary patterns. But this is really then how do people access everything that's being produced? And then how much is represented by each one of these market channels? So what's their market relevance? And then who is using each one of these, or how are these being used by consumers? And as we explored that, we really started to get into what are the procurement decision drivers, because they're different at different levels of the value chain, as we'll discuss. And then ultimately to estimate what's the 30% of all food and beverage expenditures now that would be represented. And I think it's important here just to make a note that you previously may have been part of the presentations or have read other documentation from this project that speaks to regional food resiliency, which is the volume 1 or 2 that Christian Peters put together in terms of production, that really looks at it in terms of servings. And in our case, this is going to talk to the metric, the unit is going to be dollars. So I just want to highlight that that's a difference in the percentage. Percentages that I'll talk about today are all relative to dollar value and based on what people spend on food. And then finally, we want to discuss, and this will be part of the conversation that we can have all together at the end, is basically where are the opportunities for market channels to be doing more to help increase? Because it turns out we're not at 30% of regional food expenditures as it is. So let's just start. For this, we had to kind of first understand, where does food fit in the overall equation? And so a lot of our early research here comes from the Consumer Expenditures series, and there are a few other resources as well that we draw from. But from this, we know that over the course of the last several years, food more or less represents in this 11 to 13% range of overall expenditures. So food is competing with housing, transportation, healthcare, educational cost, all of these other things. And it kind of holds this space of being, between 11 or 12 and 13%. Now, it's important to acknowledge that how this translates across an annual household's income matters. And so we see that the dollar value of these percentages that different households by race and ethnicity are able to spend on food varies accordingly, and not necessarily equitably. So here we can see that, for example, a white household might spend a little under $9,000 a year on food, compared to a Black household, which has just over 6,000 expenditures on food. And then within food, you can see in the categories below kind of a distribution of who spends more or less on various categories of food. We also looked at this. So this is the distribution of how much is spent on the various food categories. And here we can take into consideration, obviously, the fact that food costs different amounts. And so perhaps not unsurprisingly, beef, pork, poultry, seafood, and things like that, there's a higher expenditure there because those things do tend to cost more when you go to buy them. The largest category here is interesting. It is the miscellaneous foods, the sugars and sweets and the fats and oils that represent quite a significant part here of the equation in terms of what food expenditures are for each household. So I won't go into reading each one of these, but you can kind of see the distribution. And we'll spend some time talking about this food at home and food away from home. Largely what's to be understood there is food at home is what households are purchasing, perhaps at a grocery store, that is then brought back to the household and prepared at the house, whereas food away from home tends to be food that's purchased at a restaurant, for example. Here you'll see that in the Northeast, which is more inclusive than just New England, by the way, based on this public data set, it does include New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey as well. But you can see here also that based on the year of 2021, food at home is a larger percentage than food away from home, whereas actually the trend since 2010 has been that households spend more on food away from home than they do on food bought to be consumed at home. And we'll talk in a minute about how New Hampshire and Maine are an exception to that. So nationally, when households started spending more on food away from home in 2010, Massachusetts quickly followed. You can see the difference here. 54% is spent on food away from home versus 46% for food at home. Maine and New Hampshire continue to be the exceptions to this rule. It may be a factor of being more rural-based states. You know, fewer people in fewer areas of the state, perhaps going out to restaurants or the like. But New Hampshire and Maine are exceptions to this, which means that the grocery retail sector is even more important here because folks are shopping for food there to prepare and buy, to buy and prepare at home. Also of importance to note here, I pulled out this so we could see it a little bit better. This is the per capita, so per person versus per household food expenditures as of 2019. And the US national average was $5,444. All of the New England states are above this line. Food costs more, and New Englanders spend more on food in general. You can see New Hampshire has the 6th highest of all of the states in per capita state level food expenditures. And so that's important to note. It could be a factor of how far food has to travel to reach us here in the Northeast. It's not necessarily explained or examined by this particular data set, but food costs more and we spend more on food in general in New England than the national average. So we were asked to calculate what would 30% by 2030 look like. And when you dig into our volume, there's a number of ways to calculate this because there's 3 critical sources that and underlying data sets that could be used. Most significantly different between them, perhaps, is the fact that some take into account visitor spending and tourist dollars that also get spent on the total food and beverage market as estimated. So here we have a low and high estimate of what 30% of the total food and beverage market basically looks like in New England. And it ranges from 55 billion all the way up to almost 100 billion as we project out to 2030. And therefore, 30% of that is between 16.6 billion today and potentially upwards of 30 billion in the future. On a per capita basis, because we wanted some way to say, okay, how do we make this accessible somehow to help move the needle on this? We looked at what the per person per capita spend would be. And currently the low estimate is about $1,152 being spent on regional foods, up to upwards of $1,760. And so if we project out by 2030, if we wanted 30% of the food being purchased in New England to have been grown, raised, harvested in New England, we would be asking every single person to spend $1,890 basically on regional food. We absolutely know that that is not remotely possible based on myriad factors, not the least of which is access in all of its forms of geography and economic access, cultural access, et cetera. So this is really an exercise to look at what would it take and recognizing that obviously it's not going to be every single individual's responsibility to be able to purchase this amount. And it's clear that given the distribution of population, when we think about per capita, means that certain states like Massachusetts and Connecticut, who have the lion's share of the population in New England, would be carrying that much more of the responsibility for helping us get to this amount. Just by state, to be able to point out New Hampshire here, because it does vary by state, the size of the state and your food and beverage expenditures and your population. This is what it looks like for New Hampshire with a low and high estimate by 2030 of spending between $1,130 and over $1,800 per person on regionally produced or sourced food. Okay, so let's get into some market channels now that we've kind of established the food and beverage market space and the numbers of it all. We wanted to just illustrate basically how food is traveling and how these market channels get represented. So across the top, there is always the option for food to go directly from where it's produced or harvested to the consumer through a variety of direct-to-consumer channels that many of you are familiar with. Farm stands, CSAs, etc. And then below this line, there's also a number of options for food to either go to processing, to go into being in a manufactured product, to going straight to distribution or wholesale, sometimes then moving also through a food service management company before it ultimately ends up in an institution, on a grocery store shelf, on your restaurant menu and plate. And then there's also food flows through the charitable food system as well, prior to getting to end consumers. Every time food is touched through this value chain, it takes on additional value and amount. And so when we were looking at those numbers on the prior slides and thinking about what those dollar values represent, they theoretically represent food at its highest value in the system as well, because it's based on a consumer expenditures or the price that's paid by the end buyer, which could be in some cases not necessarily the end consumer, but the institution that the end consumer is eating at, if the end consumer is not actually paying for the meal per se. But this is just to say that basically the cost of food increases as it travels through this value chain, and its value therefore increases as it travels through. So when we break this down, we definitely wanted to speak to direct to sales, because New England is quite exceptional in that it tends to have a higher percentage of direct to sales of agricultural product than other parts of the US, with some exceptions obviously being places like California. But here we have the breakdown of the total sales, how much of this is agricultural sales, how much is flowing directly to the consumer, how much is flowing through intermediaries like our food hubs into institutions, and then what are all of those other ag sales that are potentially, things like potatoes sold to Arida that, go out and are manufactured into a national product, consumer packaged good, basically. So here, for instance, if we look at New Hampshire is actually doing really great because it's channeling, even though it has a smaller portion of agricultural sales perhaps than other New England states, it's doing a great job of direct to consumer sales and direct to intermediary sales. And that in part is facilitated by the great network of food hubs, for example, that you have in New Hampshire that is helping this, and those direct to consumer marketplaces that New Hampshire has been able to nurture. So good job, kudos to New Hampshire for that. And then these are retail food sales. So looking at how much of what food is being accessed through each one of these market channels, you can pretty quickly see that grocery stores and restaurants, both limited service and full service restaurants, make up the lion's share of these sales. To the right, we still have liquor stores, food service, convenience stores, specialty food, drinking places, caterers, all of our food trucks and the mobile food services. And then this tiny little portion of direct sales is down there at 0.3%. So the majority of food that everyone's eating is either being obtained from the supermarkets, the grocery stores, the big box stores, or through some restaurant. And this is just how it carries over, obviously, into the individual states based on their size. So why is this so important? Well, as you can see from this slide, a number of the stores even that dominate this landscape are not necessarily the first stores that come to mind when we think about sourcing regional food. There's an abundance of dollar stores and Dollar Generals. Then we have our kind of more familiar grocery retailers, the Stop and Shop, Shaw's, Hannaford's, etc., that are here. But there's obviously great domination here in proliferation of dollar stores. I saw Alan Reitz on here, and so I'm always delighted to see Alan because we are fortunate in New England to have some number of food co-ops who are just invaluable partners in this space, competing with some of those national and multinational brands, but who happen to be huge supporters of regional foods and in sourcing those. And so Vermont has 13, you can see Mass has 8, New Hampshire has 7, and there's probably more that aren't even captured here. But these food cooperatives are invaluable in this landscape to being opportunities to channel more regional food. They're already parts of our neighborhoods and our communities, and they can be an even bigger part.
I just want to add that I also, a little shout out to Littleton Food Co-op, who's also on this call. So that means we have 2 of those 7 food cooperatives represented, if not more.
I think more, because I think the food co-op stores of New Hampshire are multiples of the 7. So
wow.
Yes, but yeah, kudos to Littleton too. They do a great job. Right. So what did we learn as part of this? And as we're trying to influence and seeing like if so many people are getting so much of their food from these grocery retailers, how are we going to influence them to source more regional food? And one of the key challenges we have is even though they might have been founded locally here in New England, they might be currently held, controlled, and all decision buying made by a national or international company or multinational company. And some of these are highlighted here. So trying to influence some of the purchasing of these is, you know, not necessarily all at the discretion of the local general manager. So we did reach out, we did some primary research, Hubman specifically, and surprisingly, we were told on multiple occasions either they could not or would not provide data related to their regional sourcing. But one of our hopes is that there are still a number of smaller grocery retailers in the region, perhaps with fewer individual stores, but whose decision-making is still based in the region and could be influenced to be a bigger, better partner in sourcing regional food. The consolidation in this space was not lost on us as we went through this process. So you can see increasingly a fewer number of food stores control food sales. The same is true as we look at grocery categories, that a fewer number of businesses control a higher percentage of the market share within major food categories. And then this consolidation extends over into the distribution world. So we can't really even talk about grocery retail without talking about the distribution sector and all of the ways that food first travels to and gets on these shelves. And so in the report, we highlight some of the challenges of distribution and the inaccessibility to small and medium-sized farms and producers who are the dominant profile of producers in New England. And what is most important on this particular table is the fact that as a distributor becomes larger in its scope, say from Northeast to national to global, you see that its likelihood of featuring regional or local foods diminishes. And so that's what makes it so important to have, in the same way that we have food cooperatives on the grocery retail space, to have food hubs who are regionally focused and helping to support in this intermediary space of distribution are small and medium-sized farmers and food producers and fishers in New England. On the restaurant side, this was nearly impossible to scratch. There are 37,000 food service and drinking places in New England. Of these, basically, the profile is that of those, 53% are independent restaurants, which might have 1 or 2 locations, and the remainder are basically chains. You can see to the right-hand side that there's a list of the leading national chains of restaurants and how many stores they represent. I guess a hopeful point in this was that in 2023, the top culinary trend identified in some of the restaurant industry publications was that of experiences, local culture, and community, with 74% of adults likely to order locally sourced food if they see it on a menu. And that is encouraging. But we know that similarly to the grocery retail sector, for restaurants, the larger they are, the less likely we are going to be able to influence their menus, because they tend to be standardized menus and they tend to be sourcing under a model of economies of scale, which means they're going for the biggest, largest possible purchase that they can at the lowest possible price, and looking to provide a lot of consistency across their platforms, not necessarily customization, as would come with local and regional. And these are a continuation of the quick service restaurants in America. You can see the proliferation there. Here again is just the fact that restaurants are also faced with a number of different challenges, but fortunately, one of the things that they've said that they're using to meet challenges is to purchase more items from local sources. So we'd love to be able to influence this. Going door to door for restaurants is definitely going to be a Herculean effort. And is kind of different from going after some of the retailers, because there's just fewer ways to go after them, and there's not a whole heck of a lot of transparency and access afforded to them. I am keeping track of time, Colleen and Nicole, just so you know, we're almost there.
You're doing great.
We also look at institutions, and so what's really important is that while institutions represent less than 4% of total food and beverage sales, they are extremely important because about 25% of New England's population spends time in one every day. And sometimes people might spend more than, time in more than one institution in a day, depending on what their occupation is or where they're at in their life. So we do have a breakdown here by public and private schools, higher ed, early childhood care, hospitals, jails, and prisons. We did not attempt to go after corporate offices, which you could list here, government facilities and things like that, leisure and recreation. We speak to these in the report, but it was harder to get the specific numbers for those, basically. It is important to note here that the autonomy of the consumer varies greatly across these platforms. So in prisons and jails, those consumers don't have really any decision-making autonomy over what they're eating or what they're selecting. And so it's important to just recognize that also regulations and such also are more prescriptive, say in public K through 12 schools that are going by national nutrition regulations than say an independent private K through 12 school that doesn't adhere to the national child nutrition regulations and reimbursements. So it's just important to note that across these institutional platforms, the autonomy of the decision maker to choose regional and local is not necessarily at the consumer level. I think I saw Stacy Perslow out there, and I just want to call out New Hampshire Farm to School as being an important part of this equation in terms of moving more regional food into schools. Our data for public K through 12 largely came from the USDA's Farm to School census. Not everyone participates in the census, so the data is representative of those who did respond to the census from public K through 12 schools. But because food is fixed by regulations, it did allow us to look more deeply at this particular segment. And you can just see that requirements have an impact. So, for example, fluid milk tends to be the most frequently reported local food served, not only because dairy tends to be more regional in its nature, although that has evolved over time, it is also part of the federal nutrition requirements. as is the servings of fruits and vegetables and certain grains. We looked at the top 20 local items currently purchased in school nutrition programs, for example. Here you can see New Hampshire, 81% of those who responded are purchasing apples. Apparently carrots and whatever is under other also are hugely popular, squash and cucumbers. But this gave us an idea of what particular items are currently being purchased and where the opportunities are by state in this particular segment. And then we also did a little exercise to kind of say, okay, if we kind of adjusted the frequency of offering regional food, what could that shift? And so just taking an example of, say, an apple, a local fruit, if, we shifted from 30% of institutions purchasing it daily to 48%, and you can see the flow across here, we have the potential, even in a outlet where it's only open 180 days of the year, to move the needle by 13 million servings. So this exercise could be carried out for any number of categories. Basically, it's here to illustrate institutions do have significant purchasing power, regardless if they represent just 4% of overall food and beverage spend. Okay, the total volume is 130 pages, so I've not done it justice. But some of the big pieces to recall are that while there's heavy concentration in grocery retailers and restaurants, all markets need to be part of meeting our regional goals. So we don't have to spend any time debating, if one is better than the other. Everyone needs to be working wherever they can in all of the market channels to do this. Distribution is a component, right? It is part of how individual stores and restaurants are all sourcing. So that's part of being dependent on larger logistical networks. So we can't just look at the end market. We have to look at the systems that support that market as being partners in getting more regional food into the system. We've talked about the size of the market not necessarily equating to the importance to who eats there. We do also explore in the volume the fact that market options are simultaneously ubiquitous and insufficient. What does that mean? There may be loads of grocery stores, there are Dollar Generals and things like that in neighborhoods, but then there's also lots of low income, low access tracts. You simply don't have the accessibility to food or the types of food that they would like to have access to affordably. Seasonality is going to continue to kind of factor into this 30% by 2030 when we think about what's available in local markets in New England. We're not going to be able to rely on direct to consumer alone of these fresh and local products. We also have to think about how we're going to move regionally grown and harvested product into manufactured foods with more, as an ingredient. And then to be mindful that the population is changing and shifting and evolving always. So we have to adapt to that. And one of the biggest challenges we ran into is not having any kind of uniform tracking system to know what everyone was using. And there's lack of transparency and standardization of definition. And so the local food count that's currently underway is maybe helping for us to understand this better as we move forward. And I think then we have some convening questions. I don't know if I want to start here or just open it up to general questions from the group. I will just let you know that the convening questions are basically built off from the key takeaways. So how might we basically get to 30% by 2030? But and maybe
Thank you so much, Holly.
Should I stop sharing while we talk?
Sure. Although you might have to pop it back up to refer to slides. I think you did the 130-page volume justice. Thank you so much. That was really helpful for me, and I've seen all this before. Before we dive into questions, I just want to say to everyone on the call that this information, all of the data sets and more with typed up explanations of them are available. I know we don't all have the time to dig into them and read them, but they are all in that report. the Food Alliance team has a bunch of the executive summaries printed out. And if you want a copy, always reach out to me and Colleen and we'll pop one in the mail to you. We're happy to do that, or a certain volume. We're happy to help provide the report in that way. And I'll stop and let Holly answer some questions. Colleen, do you want to, are any raising to the surface for you?
I'm just scrolling back through here. I think Steve Ford had a very specific question about slides 22 and 23, specifically about the percentage of revenue listed, if that is actually for food, particularly in the dollar store categories.
Okay, and this is why we said we might have to go back to the slides 22, and let me just see here. So on those slides, I think these are the supermarkets in New England. Let me see if I can share this again. I think it was an important point that I should have maybe just kept these slides up while we have this conversation. Let me try this. Hopefully I'm referring to the right slides. Colleen, does this look familiar from the question in the chat?
I think so. Steve, I don't if you want to give us a thumbs up if this is what your question
Or do you
was.
want to chime in, Steve, and ask your question?
Yeah, by all means.
I'll just read the question aloud while we're reading to hear. Question reads slides 22 to 23. What percent of revenue listed is actually for food, especially the dollar stores? So it might be back, I think, one.
Oh no, I think it's not here. It doesn't, the question being, yes, is this just food? And in a dollar store or Dollar General, it's not going to be just food. These are total revenue. So this is not representative of food. You can imagine that these numbers for some of the others that are more food forward in terms of their offering are mostly for food, although we know that there's plenty of non-food aisles located at any of these. But there is a general percentage, I think mentioned someplace in the report, of what percentage of grocery retail space is allocated to food versus non-food, but we don't have specific numbers by the different stores of how much is food or non-food sales.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I captured a few of the chat questions that I could maybe answer pretty quickly here. So, and maybe others will want to weigh in here, but one of the questions I saw was whether or not this was going to be shared with the congressional delegation. I think I saw that someplace here with legislators and policymakers, and they are one of the key audiences of this report. And I know that there's specific efforts to make sure that this report is in their hands and being shared. I don't know, Nicole, if you want to add to that from the New England Food System Planners Partnership work at all.
No, I think that summarizes what I know about it.
Okay. Another question here was how does SNAP dollars fit into this, as well as market match and double up bucks? So if those are being supported through the direct to consumer, they're going to be in the direct to consumer sales numbers as well. They'll count there, and likewise they'll count among sales to the grocery retailers. So those are being incorporated across their, wherever the funding is actually being, the benefit is being spent, is captured in these. Deeper data on the role of grocery co-ops in market access, other than to say that they gave us some of the most access in terms of understanding who they're actually sourcing from and the number of farmers and that they support, for example. Just go over to this. Oh, it was back. Just to point out the co-ops in this question. So no, not other than to say that we know that they're already doing a heavy lift for us in terms of sourcing regional food. We just know that because of their mission base operations, and that we're most likely to rely on food cooperatives to be part of the grocery retail equation. Although if you look at the numbers of stores of co-ops versus those in those kind of national and multinational chains, obviously the national and multinational chains have got to be a part of the equation as well. Don't think I did Ruth's question justice, but Colleen or Nicole, other questions here?
Heather just added one in the bottom if you want to read it, or I can.
Yes. So Heather's question, New England spends more per capita on food than some other parts of the country, right? They're in the top 6 of what is spent on food. Can you tell from the data if our food is more expensive, or we just spend because we have higher incomes as well? We do not know that from the data, Heather. And in fact, some of the information that we had was part of a brand new series that was released in April of 2023, and you will have noticed that the date on this report is May 2023. So we got a whole new series of state level data from an entirely different underlying source about a month before, and Scott Sawyer did an amazing effort of trying to incorporate that. But the truth is, Heather, in some cases we have data, but there's actually no underlying explanation for why that might be. So for why New England states are spending more, it is for any number of reasons of land costs more, food travels farther, food is more expensive here, and all of those things. But if you dig into the USDA's Economic Research Services, this is the April 2023 Estimating State Level Food Expenditure Series. It does explain perhaps how they've accounted for some of the noise in the data and tried to account for some of those things so that it is so this comparison makes sense across this number of states. I think I saw someone raise their hand too. Did someone raise their hand and wanted to ask a question aloud?
Alan Reitz.
Alan, correct everything I've been saying incorrectly so far, please. And lend your perspective.
So much, Holly. Ever since I first met you, it's just like, Holly's on? Okay, I'm on. No, I just wanted to add something to your accurate comment about or question that Ruth had raised from Quabbin Harvest Co-op, which I just looked up, and it looks like a fabulous co-op in Massachusetts. One of the ways in terms of data dive that the data could be parsed, and it might already be in there, but I can say that cooperatives as a whole, when we look at their percentage of sales of food overall, the percentage of local regional food is so much greater, of course, than you would find in a typical supermarket, as in chain stores. Our independent grocers also deserve a good call out too. Those are those small, good community markets. Another aspect that I think even takes the data dive a little deeper, it is the length of the season and the access that those local and regional producers have on the shelves of a food co-op, where a large supermarket is probably going to want that corn, and I want those peppers, and I want those tomatoes. But are they going to be carrying the potatoes deep into November and December, and the carrots and the root vegetables? Probably not. So it's not, to add to Holly's comment, it is both the access to the store shelves and the length of time and the collaboration that happens that I think is true for co-ops and true for the independent mom and pops.
On this, I think it might be interesting on the K through 12 side, when we looked at New Hampshire and what New Hampshire actually sources. We should tell everyone to take a Dramamine before attending one of my presentations as I flip back and forth through these slides. But here, I looked at New Hampshire and said, well, hey, look at that, lettuce, 31%. That might seem surprising. But then think about the fact that we have actually in New England a number of hydroponically grown lettuce sources, which allow lettuce to be available at times of the year when, outside of when it's typically at peak season when schools are out of session. exactly. So I looked at this and at first I was like, lettuce, really 31%. And then I thought, oh, it's probably because schools are purchasing a lot of hydroponic lettuce. If it is longer lasting on their shelves, we've just seen that in a number of school districts that sourcing hydroponic lettuce is a better economical choice. It stands up better on the plate, looks better, kids eat it, etc. But to Alan's point about the seasonality, there are some surprises here in the data as well. Rick's question about have you captured donated or gleaned food distributed through food banks and other charitable venues? Yes, so there is a part of the report that speaks to the proliferation also of our food banks in New England and their size and what they're sourcing. For some, we have better data than not. In some cases, like in Massachusetts with their MIFAP program, they have in prior years published complete annual reports of who they source from and what they source and the dollar value of what they sourced. So that is helpful. In some cases, this is captured as part of what farmers report through the USDA Ag Census is in there as well. And then I also will just note that there's a very small section of this report. We do acknowledge the fact that there is value to food that people grow for themselves. We do not explore it because it's not a market channel. The food is not necessarily purchased if it's grown for individual use. But we do account for it and acknowledge the fact that it has value as part of the overall equation of consumer expenditures on food. Okay, just scanning. Or anyone else have their hand raised and want to ask another question or comment?
We maybe have time for one more, but you really moved through most of them, I think. I'm scanning as well. Any last questions, everyone? A big thank you from stellar farmer, farm owner, woman extraordinaire, Sarah Cox on here. I'm not going to read it all aloud. Well, I'll start to wrap us up here while we give everyone one more minute to ask questions, and say thank you so much, Holly, for being here. That was phenomenal. As always, learned so much from you. Thank you, Colleen. Please take 15 seconds to fill out our Network Cafe evaluation. Let us know if this was helpful for you, what we could do in future network cafes to improve them. And sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat over here. We have the next Network Cafe in early February will be focused on one of the outcomes of the New England Feeding New England report, which is that New Hampshire, spearheaded by the New Hampshire Food Alliance and the New Hampshire Department of Ag Markets and Food, is going to be creating a New Hampshire Food and Agriculture Strategic Plan over the next year. So if you want to hear a bit about that, you can go onto our website or join us for the next Network Cafe to hear a short summary of the proposed process, where we're at in the process, and then spend the majority of the time, about 3/4 of the time, giving your input on what you think that plan should include. Colleen, what did I miss?
That's it. A lot of those links and things that Nicole just referred to are in the chat. Yeah, we're so glad that you're here today, and we're so looking forward to seeing you all in February.
Can I, since we have a couple of minutes, can I go back to the chat?
Sure.
Sorry to move us out of sync here. You know, everyone's ready to exit, but you know, we have 7 more minutes for conversation, so why not? I just wanted to acknowledge Donna's comment, which is really important here. And you know, as a research team, we had these weekly and ongoing conversations about what's working well in certain places of getting more regional food. And you know, obviously there's more success where you have values-based decision-making, like in a cooperative or independent grocery store realm, right? So that's really important. And the same is true for institutions where, you know, there's values-based purchasing happening, which isn't necessarily the business model of what's happening in these other larger conglomerate grocery retailers and restaurant chains that we discussed. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that Donna is absolutely right on in this comment in the chat. And whether or not we're going to be able to influence them with regulation or otherwise, I don't know, if that's the, the busting up of monopolies or what that looks like. But one of the things we did reflect on is what had made the institutional sector have more success, perhaps, than others in shifting hearts and minds towards the importance of regionally sourced food. And one of the things we recognize is the importance of like community and cooperation. And in the institutional realm, you tend to have groups of people who know each other, who trust one another, or at least are able to communicate and work together. Whereas when you're trying to influence a grocery retailer or a chain restaurant to do something, who is everybody else? It's every other shopper of that particular store or patron of that restaurant. And it's much, much harder to coalesce the advocacy for these particular market channels. And so that's going to be one of the things that we also need to consider is how do we coalesce increased support for the folks who are already doing the great job, like the cooperatives and the independent grocers, and how do we coalesce advocacy to help those who aren't doing as big a job as they could to shift? How do we do that through aggregated demand when we are dispersed as an audience? That's definitely a difference that we see. And so, what can we learn from our success in the institutional segment, basically, and how do we apply that to this whole other area? Like Donna's comment prompted that, and we spend a lot of time kind of trying to explore that. And that's part of where we speak to the fact that percentage of market channel does not necessarily equate to the importance based on who shops there. But recognizing that how we influence these market channels is not, it differs. And we have different coalescing and, power basically as the consumers to influence these different market channels. And in some cases, we just have absolutely no access. I mean, the black box that is the distribution channel and some of the larger retailers is phenomenal. Be a really fun project for someone who has nothing else to do and a lot of money and a lot of energy to chase them down. So yeah, okay. So thanks for letting me go back to that for a moment before we end.
That was a beautiful way to end. Thank you. I'm tempted to ask you a question, but I'm going to hold myself back.
We have 2.5 minutes.
Should we use every last drop?
What's your question?
My question is probably too big for 2.5 minutes, but is just, what would you do if you had a sort of realistic magic wand and to focus on one area of, given all of this data and all of your other knowledge? Is there an area that feels really ripe for change to you? I'm sure, or just in generally for New England.
No, this is the whole point of writing the bullet point about it takes everything in all places at once. Like if you can do something by making a daily choice, do it. If you are in a position of power to influence values-based procurement someplace, do it. If you are part of like playing the role, like I see Caitlin out there, I see Alan and Stacy and all of you are already playing some role in this because you're in this room. Great, keep doing what you're doing, do more of it, ask people to give you more money and more capacity to do more of all of the good work that you're doing every place. What I learned from my days in sustainability and corporate social responsibility is we waste far too much time trying to figure out the best thing when everyone could be spending time and energy just doing something right now. And so I will not give you the one. I will just say everyone can contribute to this wherever they are, whatever they're doing. And that is already making a difference and can make a bigger difference. So the great thing is no one has to waste any time trying to figure out the best way to do this when there's so many ways to be doing it.
I love that answer. I think it's spot on. And everyone rest assured, I feel like I'm a TV show host right now. Holly will be back with us in March, hosting a listening session in partnership with the Aspires program of UVM. And so you will see her see her then again. Thank you again, Holly, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all you do.
Everyone.
Take care.